Sheep are everywhere on our planet. In China alone, there are about 140 million of them.
There's only one thing on the menu for most New Zealand sheep, and that's good old-fashioned rye grass. On a remote island in the South Pacific, thousands of sheep were left to fend for themselves. No farmers, no fences, no feed, just wind, rain, and endless miles of rough terrain. What started as a bold farming experiment slowly turned into something far more disturbing. Over time, the land changed. So did the sheep. Most people have never heard this story. And those who have, well, they still struggle to believe how it ended. This is the story about what happens when nature is pushed too far. They left the sheep on an island without pasture. And the results shocked everyone. Origins and abandonment. Campbell Island sits alone in the South Pacific, about 300 miles south of New Zealand's mainland. Cold, windy, and surrounded by violent seas. It's not the kind of place most would expect to find farmland. But in the late 19th century, that's exactly what happened. In 1895, a New Zealander named James Gordon took up a lease to graze livestock on Campbell Island. The idea was straightforward: introduce sheep, sell the wool, and turn a remote outpost into a profitable sheep station. Within a few years, other settlers followed. They brought in hundreds of sheep, mainly Merino and Cheviot breeds. At the time, there were no natural predators on the island, and the vegetation was untouched. On paper, it looked like a perfect setup. One of the most ambitious settlers was a man named John Warren. By 1900, John had bought out earlier leaseholders and expanded operations. He brought in even more sheep, and over time, the flock grew into the thousands. By 1913, it's estimated that the island supported between 7,000 and 8,000 sheep. That's a high number considering the island is just 43 square miles in size. The sheep thrived at first. The grasses, shrubs, and mega herbs covering the island offered more than enough food in the beginning. The climate was rough, but the animals adapted. Their thick wool coats protected them from the cold and wind. There were no diseases to worry about and no predators. This was a closed system with one major variable: how long the land could sustain that many mouths. The terrain itself made management difficult. Campbell Island isn't flat. It's full of steep ridges, boggy lowlands, and dense vegetation. Moving sheep around or building proper fencing was next to impossible. The flocks were left to roam freely, often spreading across the island without much control. Over time, that became a problem. Even in good years, retrieving all the sheep for shearing was hit or miss. Losses were expected. But as long as enough wool came off the backs of those that were caught, the operation kept going. In 1916, John sold the lease and left the island. His successors tried to continue the sheep farming, but the remote location and harsh conditions were always working against them. Regular supply runs were difficult, and workers often went months without contact from the outside world. Radio communication didn't come until much later, and winter storms could trap people on the island for weeks. Accidents happened and help was never close. By the 1920s, things were already starting to fall apart. The cost of maintaining the lease, running boats to and from the island, and paying wages was climbing. Wool prices were unstable. Weather patterns were getting more unpredictable, and the island's plant life was already showing signs of stress. In 1931, the final leaseholders gave up. They walked away from the island and left everything behind, including the sheep. There was no formal closure, no organized removal of livestock. The station buildings began to rot, fences fell, and the sheep, now completely feral, continued to live and breed on the island without human involvement. This marked the start of one of the most unusual animal experiments in the Southern Hemisphere. Though it wasn't planned as such, the sheep left behind began living entirely on their own in a fully closed and isolated environment. For decades, no one stepped foot on the island regularly. The sheep were left to fend for themselves. No feed, no shearing, no intervention. Reports from later expeditions noted that the animals began to change. Without the pressure of human handling or selective breeding, their coats grew out of control. Some developed heavier frames. Others began to show signs of malnutrition. But despite the odds, they survived. The feral sheep population became part of Campbell Island's strange legacy. At this point in time, the island had no formal protection. It was just abandoned land with a feral sheep problem. It would be another 2 decades before the New Zealand government would declare it a nature reserve and take a serious look at the situation. But by then, the damage was already setting in. This chapter in Campbell Island's story ends with silence. The farmers were gone. The building stood empty. And across the wind-beaten hills, thousands of sheep moved without order, slowly eating their way through the island's future. Population explosion amid famine. By the mid-20th century, Campbell Island's feral sheep had entered a dangerous cycle. With no humans left to control the flock, the sheep spread across the island unchecked. Over the years, they grazed on everything they could reach. Native plants, many of which were never exposed to grazing animals before, started to disappear. Grasses vanished first, then the shrubs, and finally the slow-growing mega-herbs that made Campbell Island unique. These weren't just any plants. Species like Chlorophyllum, Anisotome, and Azarella had evolved to survive subantarctic weather, not the relentless pressure of thousands of hooves and mouths. They had no defenses, no thorns, no toxins, nothing to stop the sheep from devouring them. Once gone, they didn't grow back quickly. The island's recovery rate was far slower than that of the mainland pastures. Each growing season was short, and cold winds made regrowth difficult. Early aerial surveys and government field reports from the 1950s described entire slopes stripped of vegetation. Photographs from these expeditions show bare earth where dense plant cover used to be. Soil erosion followed. Without plant roots to anchor the soil, heavy rain and runoff started cutting into the hillsides. Small landslides and mud slumps became common in parts of the island that were once stable. With the landscape changing fast, the sheep themselves began to suffer. What started as abundance had turned into famine. Overgrazing meant the animals had to wander further to find food. In the higher ridges, where little grew to begin with, the sheep were often seen scraping at moss and lichen just to stay alive. Eyewitness accounts from expedition teams in the early 1960s mention animals with visible rib cages, thin limbs, and signs of starvation. Several were found dead near streambeds, where they likely came for water but didn't have the strength to move on. Even lamb survival rates dropped. Without enough milk-producing ewes and with poor quality forage, the younger animals couldn't make it through winter. Despite the harsh conditions, some parts of the island still supported small, more stable subpopulations. In sheltered valleys or isolated patches near the coast, limited grazing land remained. Sheep that stuck to those areas fared better, but the overall population trend was downward. The island could no longer carry the thousands of animals it once did. By some estimates, the population had dropped from nearly 8,000 at its peak to around 1,000 to 2,000 by the late 1950s. Still, these animals had adapted in ways no one expected. Without annual shearing, their wool grew continuously. Some had thick, matted coats that collected rain and dirt, which only made survival harder in winter. In some cases, heavy wool pulled down on the animals' backs and legs, slowing them down and contributing to exhaustion. Scientists who visited the island in this period noted how isolated sheep had become biologically distinct. Cut off from mainland breeding stock for decades, the Campbell Island sheep had developed unique traits, slightly heavier frames, higher wool yield per animal, and different behavioral patterns. They were more cautious, more dispersed, and harder to spot in the field. Even so, there was no sustainable future. The land was still degrading, and the remaining sheep were competing over scraps. The entire ecosystem was off balance. Without outside interference, the sheep were slowly starving themselves into extinction. While taking the island's rare plants with them, insiders who worked in early conservation planning meetings described the situation as a closed-loop collapse. The animals were alive, but only barely, and every year the land produced less food. Doing nothing was no longer an option. The damage was becoming irreversible, and scientists warned that if left alone much longer, both the sheep and the native ecosystem would disappear together. But intervention wouldn't begin just yet. For now, the sheep kept wandering across what was left of the island's surface, leaner, fewer, and hungrier each year. Fences, rescue, and culling plans. The first real attempt to manage the sheep on Campbell Island came in the early 1970s. After years of aerial surveys and occasional field visits, the New Zealand Department of Lands and Survey decided to step in. The condition of the island's landscape had drawn attention from conservationists who warned that more delays would mean permanent ecological loss. In 1970, a team was sent to Campbell Island with a clear mission to begin the process of separating the sheep and preparing for long-term control. They started by building a fence across the island. Despite the weather, workers managed to install a barrier that split the island into two sections, north and south. This line was intended to isolate groups of sheep, making it easier to control numbers and monitor results. Once the fence was in place, the northern section was targeted first. Government records show that more than 1,300 sheep were shot over a short period. The shooting was done on foot with teams moving through the area using rifles to cull the animals in a controlled and organized way. The goal was to eliminate the entire northern population and give the land a chance to recover. The southern section, however, was left untouched. This part of the island still held several hundred sheep, possibly over 1,000, depending on who you asked. According to people involved in the project, there was hesitation about removing all the sheep at once. Some argued that a small number should be left alive for research. Others saw a chance to preserve the genetic line of the feral population. In 1975, a small group of live sheep, just under 10, was removed from the island and transported back to mainland New Zealand. The animals were carefully selected and quarantined before being moved into controlled breeding programs. These sheep, though feral, had survived decades of exposure to extreme conditions. Their hardiness and unique genetic traits made them valuable. Scientists wanted to see what could be learned from a population that had been isolated for nearly 80 years. One of the scientists involved in this rescue effort was Richard Herr, a researcher with experience in remote island ecosystems. Richard and others believed that the Campbell Island sheep were a living record of environmental adaptation. He argued that removing a handful for breeding could preserve the line without interfering with the larger goal of ecological restoration. After the rescue, plans to remove the rest of the sheep stalled. The fencing held and the northern section remained sheep-free, but the southern population continued to roam. It would take another 14 years before serious steps were taken again. In 1984, a second fence was added. This one further subdivided the island to prepare for the next stage of culling. By then, public opinion had shifted. Conservation groups pushed for full eradication. Government agencies, now working under a national biodiversity strategy, began to focus more on long-term restoration. The next major culling phase took place in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Ground teams, helicopters, and trained marksmen were used in a series of final sweeps. The focus was on thoroughness. Every part of the southern region was covered and any remaining sheep were hunted down. There were no attempts to relocate more animals. The priority was removing pressure from the land. Still, reports from some insiders suggest that not everyone agreed with this final push. A few conservation officials felt that a small controlled population could have been left behind in a protected enclosure for future study, but those voices were in the minority. The majority supported full eradication to give the island the best chance at recovery. By the end of this phase, the fences were left in place temporarily, but the sheep were gone. What remained was a barren stretch of land, still recovering from nearly a century of overgrazing. The effort to restore Campbell Island had officially entered a new phase, no longer about managing animals, but about bringing the original environment back to life. And though the land was still scarred, the people behind the fences, the rescues, and the culling believed they had taken the first necessary step toward that goal. Thousands left without grass. But you see, even though they left thousands of sheep on the island without pasture, the results shocked everyone. The full scale of the Campbell Island sheep disaster wasn't obvious at first. In fact, early reports focused on population numbers and scattered plant damage. But by the time biologists compiled a complete ecological survey in the early 1990s, the picture had changed. What they found stunned even the most experienced conservation staff. The island's vegetation had collapsed far beyond previous estimates, and the sheep had played the central role. For nearly 60 years, the feral sheep had grazed without any limit. Without predators, fencing, or rotation, they moved freely across 43 square miles of terrain, stripping the land down to its roots. And when the most palatable plants were gone, They kept eating. Moss beds, seed heads, tree bark, nothing was off limits. The sheep had outlived their food supply long before culling even began. Botanical field notes described whole valleys where the ground was exposed and lifeless. In many places, the only vegetation left was unpalatable to livestock. Some areas looked like tundra, even though they once supported thick coastal grasses and mega-herbs. These mega-herbs, massive-leaved plants unique to subantarctic islands, were gone from entire zones. In fact, several species that had once blanketed the landscape were only found in cliff cracks and small offshore islets where sheep couldn't reach them. The real shock was in the numbers. Even after multiple phases of culling, the total number of sheep removed from Campbell Island between 1970 and 1991 added up to over 7,000. That included the known kills in the northern and southern sections and dozens found dead from natural causes during surveys. Yet, those 7,000 were just what remained. The implication was clear: since abandonment in 1931, the island had supported tens of thousands more who had lived, grazed, starved, and died with no one watching. Insiders who were part of the Department of Conservation's field programs at the time later said the situation was a warning. One researcher, David Timms, later stated in interviews that the island became a case study in what happens when a closed ecosystem is pushed beyond its limits by a single species. David explained that the sheep didn't just run out of food, they took the whole system down with them. This collapse had a strange effect on the sheep themselves. As grazing became more difficult, the animals began behaving erratically. Some formed small herds near bogs and wetlands, places they would normally avoid, just to find damp vegetation. Others were seen chewing kelp along the shoreline. Their coats, left unshorn for decades, hung in thick, tangled sheets that sometimes dragged behind them or caught on branches. Expedition teams noted that some sheep had grown abnormal hooves due to a lack of wear and limited movement. In extreme cases, the overgrown wool and misaligned limbs caused the animals to collapse or become immobilized. Photographic records taken in the late 1980s show animals that appear oversized and unbalanced, with massive coats and protruding ribs. These images weren't circulated widely, but they left a lasting impression on the few who saw them. By the end of the eradication campaign, there was no doubt left. The sheep population had risen and crashed in complete isolation, leaving behind an ecological wasteland. And yet the sheep themselves had endured far longer than anyone thought possible, decades without human help, surviving in a world where the ground beneath them had stopped growing. The reveal wasn't about a single moment, but about the undeniable evidence spread across the hills and ravines. Thousands of sheep had been left behind on an island with no pasture. And the result was exactly what science warns about, but rarely gets to witness so clearly. Total imbalance. Ecological aftermath. When the last sheep were finally removed from Campbell Island, the immediate concern was whether the land could heal. For decades, the sheep had been the dominant force shaping the island's surface. Without them, scientists and conservation staff had their first chance to study natural recovery in a place that had been altered for nearly a century. The first observations were cautious. Botanists reported that native vegetation was returning, but slowly. Some of the fastest to recover were mosses and grasses that had been trampled, but not entirely destroyed. In lower-lying areas, new shoots of native tusks began to appear within a few growing seasons. These early signs offered proof that the island's natural system still had some resilience left. Plant species that had once been dominant, such as the subantarctic mega-herbs, were a different story. Their populations had been reduced to a few scattered patches. Recovery for these larger, slower-growing species depended on seed dispersal and protection from erosion. In areas where the soil was still intact, regeneration began. But in exposed zones where the sheep had stripped the ground bare, plants struggled to re-establish. Conservationists monitored these regions closely, sometimes collecting seeds by hand and spreading them in targeted areas to speed up the process. The fencing that had once divided the island for sheep control was repurposed as a research tool. It allowed scientists to track how different sections of land bounced back once grazing stopped. Some plots were left untouched while others received minor human help. Within 5 to 10 years, there was a clear difference. Even light intervention sped up the return of vegetation. But plants weren't the only part of the island affected. Bird life had suffered just as much. Before human arrival, Campbell Island had supported large populations of ground-nesting seabirds. Species like the Campbell teal and southern royal albatross relied on open, undisturbed habitat. When sheep were introduced, the birds lost ground. Nesting sites were trampled and the undergrowth needed for shelter disappeared. After the eradication, bird monitoring programs began tracking signs of recovery. The results were encouraging. Within a decade, seabird colonies started returning to parts of the island they hadn't nested in for 70 years. The Campbell teal, once considered extinct in the wild, was reintroduced from a captive population and began breeding on its own again. Researchers credited this success to the removal of both sheep and introduced predators like rats, which were wiped out in a separate operation in the early 2000s. One of the researchers involved in the restoration effort, Claire Freeman, later explained that Campbell Island had become a benchmark for high-latitude ecological recovery. Claire noted that the absence of grazing allowed native biodiversity to reassert itself in ways few expected. She described it as watching the island breathe again after being held down for generations. Still, the process wasn't quick. Even decades after the last sheep were gone, some areas remained scarred. Soil compaction, erosion, and lost seed banks continued to delay full restoration in certain pockets. Yet, the overall trend was positive. Satellite images showed green returning to the hills. Field reports listed plant species once thought to be gone, now appearing in locations where they hadn't been seen in living memory. Campbell Island's recovery became a case study in restoration ecology. It showed what was possible when invasive pressure is removed and how long recovery can take, even in isolated environments. The scars were deep, but they weren't permanent. And for the scientists who tracked every inch of regrowth, each blade of grass and every returning bird was a signal that the ecosystem hadn't given up. It had simply been waiting for space to come back. Genetic rarity. By the early 1990s, with the sheep gone from Campbell Island, the story might have ended there, but it didn't. A small group of live sheep rescued years earlier before the final eradication had been quietly breeding on the mainland. These animals were descendants of a population that had spent over 60 years surviving in isolation, adapting to a harsh subantarctic environment with no human assistance. That gave them value beyond what most expected. The group responsible for preserving the line included a handful of researchers, farmers, and conservationists. Among them was Peter Luoni, a veterinarian who helped manage the breeding program. Peter believed that the Campbell Island sheep represented more than just a rare breed. They were a genetic record of environmental pressure and survival. He and others worked to keep the line pure, avoiding crossbreeding with commercial flocks. The sheep showed distinct traits. Their wool was denser and longer than that of their mainland ancestors. Their bodies were slightly heavier and their immune systems appeared more robust, likely a result of decades without human medicine or selective care. Even their behavior was different, more wary, more independent. Though no longer needed for island restoration, the sheep became a conservation interest of their own. A small flock was maintained in New Zealand under controlled conditions. The idea was to keep the genetics alive in case future research, study, or agricultural interest ever called for them. For a time, the effort went well. The population remained small but stable, and the animals were featured occasionally in local media and university projects. But maintaining rare livestock breeds isn't easy. Funding is limited, and interest tends to fade once the immediate ecological or economic reason disappears. Over time, the number of Campbell Island sheep dwindled. By the early 2000s, only a few dozen remained. Then, in 2017, the story took an unexpected turn. 5 of the rarest ewes were found dead on a farm in Canterbury, New Zealand. They hadn't died naturally. They'd been butchered. Reports confirmed that the sheep had been taken and slaughtered, most likely for their meat. The loss was devastating. These 5 were among the last purebred descendants of the original Campbell Island population. Their genetic line could not be replaced. Authorities investigated, but no arrests were made. Conservationists called it a major setback. Some insiders described it as the quiet end of a program that had already been running on borrowed time. After the incident, efforts were made to tighten security around the few remaining sheep. But the future of the entire breed was now in doubt. What remains today is mostly historical records, tissue samples, and limited living stock. The Campbell Island sheep exist more as a symbol than a practical herd. They remind us that even when nature is restored, some parts of the past can't be brought back. And while the island itself is healing, the legacy of the sheep lives on. Not only in what they destroyed, but in what they left behind, a rare glimpse into survival, isolation, and the consequences of being forgotten.